series of campus conversations entitled From Coal to Carbon Neutrality. Tonight we're focusing on navigating the next decade. There are going to be 2 more events at least coming up in the spring, and we'll certainly be publicizing information about those as well. Our activities this evening are going to be moderated by the Oberlin College Dialogue Center. Thank you so much for coming out to help us. And I'm going to turn it over to them in a moment. I want to let John Bergen make a quick announcement.
Hey folks, we're going to be passing around this email sign-up sheet. Put your name and email down so that we can send you the minutes from this. We promise we won't send you any other emails, just the minutes. It's okay. Don't panic. Write down your email.
Okay. And before I turn it over to OCDC to go over ground rules and over to our speakers, I just want to provide a bit of context, articulate the goals of tonight's events, and just give a little bit of an introduction to our 4 speakers. So, Oberlin College is committed to the very challenging goal of climate neutrality by 2025. And as everyone in this room is aware, there is not a magic bullet solution for getting us there. And if there were, we wouldn't be here tonight. So for example, every option that we have for replacing our central heating plant, whether we think about coal, biomass, natural gas, ground source heat pumps, all of these things have obstacles, drawbacks. We're stuck, I would say, between a rock and a hard place and a dagger and a gun, right? We've got a lot of different, really difficult issues to confront no matter which way we turn. And in a way that presents a really exciting educational opportunity and intellectual challenge, but it also presents a social challenge for us to come together as a community to try to vigorously debate and yet constructively work through solutions to these really difficult problems. So tonight we're focusing on issues raised by using natural gas as a transition fuel. And we're framing the event that way for 3 particular reasons that I want to just put right out there on the table. First, we're looking at natural gas tonight because it is the most likely short-term source of heat for this world. That is not etched in blood, but it is the most likely way of things unfolding as it appears right now. Second, we know that there are terrible ethical and environmental consequences with many of the modern methods of natural gas extraction, and that we as a community, being Oberlin, have a responsibility to confront those issues and address them to the best of our ability. Finally, we're acknowledging that natural gas is not a long-term acceptable solution, and the committee and the leadership of the college fully understand and embrace that. This is not our long-term heating source. This is a short-term stopgap measure, and so one of the really important questions that we need to address as a community is how do we move away from that as quickly as possible. So in a listening session we had in October, students told us that they wanted an opportunity to deal with the issues that natural gas raises in a constructive way, that they wanted us to bring in perspectives that approach the issues from a number of different angles. And we have brought 4 people here tonight that I think represent a wide array of approaches to dealing with the issues that natural gas raises. We do not have anybody from the natural gas industry here to tell us how good for the economy natural gas is. And that was a point made by a brilliant OB student that it would completely fly in the face of all the commitments that this college has made to be bringing that voice into the conversation. We're committed to using as little fossil fuel as possible. How can we do that in the most responsible way possible? So the 4 speakers tonight represent viewpoints that have been suggested by Oberlin students. Here's our format tonight. We're going to start as a large group. First, we will have Nolan Moser, who is from the Ohio Environmental Council. He is intimately familiar with the ins and outs and deviations of the political scene in Ohio, as it relates to energy. So he will give us a quick primer in what is the political landscape in Ohio that we, as an institution and as activists, are dealing with. Then we will hear from, who did we decide was going to go next? Jordon Suter, professor of economics here at Oberlin. He will talk about the viability of creating an alternative market for frack-free gas. We will then hear from Peltz from the Environmental Defense Fund. The Environmental Defense Fund is pursuing policy options to try to control some of the more negative aspects of natural gas extraction. And finally, we will hear from Eric Belcastro from the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. He will be describing their organization's rights-based approach to dealing with the problems caused by fracking. We'll do this, each person will talk only about 10 minutes, and I'm going to be kind of rigid about that because I want to make sure that we have time for people to ask questions and then to engage afterwards. So 10 minutes of presentation, there'll be just a few minutes for questions in case people are confused. But then, once all four of the speakers have presented, we will branch out into different groups in the building so that smaller, more focused groups of people interested in a particular aspect that we've covered tonight can really have meaningful conversations, ask lots of questions, lots of back and forth with our speakers. And what we hope will come out of these events, these small groups, is key ideas that the group thinks are really worth pursuing, that they'd like to see the college carefully consider. If there's critical issue or question that they think is really important for the college to consider, we want those breakout sessions to be opportunities for you to benefit from the expertise that we have here tonight, to identify constructive things that we as a community can do to move forward. So those ideas, questions, etc. will be recorded and funneled back to me. And from there, they will be discussed and considered by the Committee on Environmental Sustainability, Office of the President, etc. I think that's all that I wanted to say. Are there any quick questions about our format tonight before I turn it over to OCDC? Yeah?
Are we getting back together after that?
You know, my sense was that it would be so darn late that we would not get back together after that, but we could sort of leave that open and see whether that makes sense. I didn't want people to be here till like midnight, is my only concern. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah?
people aren't obligated to stay, but if people want that, then maybe we should announce it now.
Okay, let's do that. So, let's see, we're starting 7:45, 45. Let's say that by 9:15, people who are interested can gather back here.
Can you clarify what the question and answer session in this larger group, the purpose of that versus the breakout group?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So questions that I think would be appropriate for this larger setting would be questions that helped clarify the limitations or the scope of the particular approaches that people are presenting, so that people can figure out, oh yeah, that's something I'm really interested in. I'd like to learn more about that. I'd like to be engaged in that conversation. Yeah. All right. I will turn it over to our facilitators from OCDC.
Hi everyone, I'm Ty, I'm Gabby. We're just going to facilitate a discussion after the speakers. Really basic rules we're going to go over.
The first rule is respect. The second rule is a step up, step back, meaning that speak, your opinion is welcome, make a point, and then please be considerate of the time that we have now for the story.
Yeah, so when people are speaking, we'll just take stack and we'll keep notes. And that's about it. Any questions? Any questions about the rules, or want to add anything or change anything? Cool.
All right. Well, hi, folks. My name is Nolan Moser. I'm with the Ohio Environmental Council. I'm going to talk briefly about the political landscape in Columbus state government, and I'll focus on energy, and we'll definitely talk about natural gas. First, I have some tough news to report. Natural gas development in Ohio has broad bipartisan support that has been sustained, I'd say, over the last 3 years since the first announcements came forward about the potential of extraction from the new shale resources in our state. So this is something that was of extreme interest to the Democratic Party under Ted Strickland, and continues obviously to be of extreme interest under the Republican Party with John Kasich. There's been a slight difference in how the two parties have maybe handled the issue, maybe a little more circumspection and willingness to go slower on the extraction side with Governor Strickland than our current governor. But essentially the same thought, and if you put yourself in the legislator's shoes at the moment, you might see why. The thought of most Ohio legislators from either the Democratic or Republican Party is our state is hurting, it's been hurting for jobs. This is a potential industry that could employ a lot of people in blue-collar work, which we used to have here and which we no longer have. So these folks see this as a huge economic opportunity, as a long-term jobs and cash cow that they can milk, and they do see it as very important. So that's a tough fact of life. The other fact of life is lots of people in Ohio are very concerned about natural gas extraction and the impact that is created to the environment, the impact of their land, the impact of their health, the impact of their water. So far, that the messages of the folks that are concerned, although they've been very aggressively put forward and with a lot of passion, haven't necessarily made significant changes. But I will note that there's a tremendous amount of energy around protecting land, water, and health resources from the impacts associated with natural gas extraction in our state. And legislators are starting to listen. And that was kind of first seen last year when the governor and our legislature put forward its big natural gas and energy bill. This eventually passed the Senate Bill 315, and it did two things. It had a usage side focused on renewable energy and energy efficiency. It made some changes to Ohio's long-standing energy efficiency rules and laws, and Ohio's long-standing renewable energy rules. These are laws that have been around since 2008. It added some new resources, one of them called combined heat and power, which is a way of capturing wasted energy from industrial facilities, adding some new fuel and creating highly efficient power. And then a lot of the action took place on the other side, which is the extraction side. So a whole series of new regulations focusing on how natural gas is extracted from the ground, what kinds of reporting is required for natural gas companies that pour chemicals into the ground to affect. There was a lot of debate. The governor contends that this set of rule packages is the strongest anywhere in the country. There's lots of folks that disagree with that. I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about that real soon. There were some very controversial provisions in the bill, including one that they call the gag rule for doctors, essentially making it very difficult for doctors to talk about the health impacts associated with natural gas extraction and impacts to water for folks that come into their offices and have problems. So very, very controversial bill, and it included some really difficult positions, not just those, but also drilling in state parks, which is now allowed in Ohio under this piece of legislation. So some really, really tough losses for the environmental community and for the public health community associated with that bill. But it did gin up a lot of activity and a lot of opposition. So we expect that to continue. As far as the elections, obviously the president won here in Ohio, and that was a big deal. But if you look down ballot to the state house, nothing much has changed. Republicans held a significant advantage in the Senate. That has stayed the same, and the Senate is heavily gerrymandered. That is unlikely to change until we have another redistricting process after the next census. A pretty similar thing in the House. The numbers were underneath there. The Republicans have a significant advantage. So essentially, we're down to one-party government here in Ohio, and that does have an impact on energy legislation. I'll talk about two quick things before I finish up. Number one, Ohio's been targeted by ALEC. This is the American, Seth, maybe you can help me, it's the American Legislative Exchange Council. Thank you very much, guys. So ALEC has targeted Ohio for rescission of its renewable energy standards. So Ohio's renewable energy standard is one of the crown jewels in our energy policy mix here in Ohio. It's created a significant amount of jobs. Ohio is one of the fastest growing states for wind installations in the country. A lot of that activity occurring in the western part of the state. All that's in jeopardy because ALEC has targeted our state. perhaps even more troubling, and we're dealing with this right now in our lame duck period, there is an attack, a direct attack on Ohio's energy efficiency standard. Now, we all know energy efficiency standard is a common sense, no-brainer thing that we can all support. It's the cleanest source of energy because it's energy you don't use. It is the cheapest source of energy, costs around 3 cents a kilowatt hour. In Ohio, it's even less. It's costing about 1.6 cents a kilowatt hour versus new energy, which is 6, 8, 11, 12 cents a kilowatt hour, and sometimes even higher. So it creates jobs. For every $1 million spent on energy efficiency, you get 21 jobs. For every $1 million spent on traditional energy sources like natural gas, you get 7 jobs. And it saves businesses money. And you have to do it locally. You can't export energy efficiency. When energy efficiency is improving building performance, insulation, new windows, better lighting, you have to do it right here in Oberlin or in Cleveland or in Columbus or Cincinnati. You can't do it across the state border or somewhere else and have it shipped in. So these are jobs that are local. It puts people directly to work. And surprise, surprise, there are some utilities that don't like this legislation, particularly First Energy, the state's largest utility, the one that has been most hostile to energy efficiency and renewable energy for years. They are going after our energy efficiency standard right now. They are trying to do it during the lame duck session. So this very short session here in December and late November that occurs before the changeover in legislators that will happen in January. And they hope to push this through as quickly as they can and as quietly as they can because it's bad for consumers, it's bad for the environment, for all those reasons we talked about. First Energy is against this bill because they're not making enough money. They're not charging you and other customers across the state, although not here in Oberlin, of course, because you have an excellent municipal utility. But they are not charging customers across the state enough for energy. Energy efficiency is driving down energy prices, specifically in northern Ohio, their service territory, and it is hurting their bottom line. So they're coming after it, and it's a really sticky situation. So I wanted to alert you to that. So when you're talking about natural gas and the impact of natural gas, there is no better way to alleviate the amount that we use in our state than to focus on energy efficiency. And energy efficiency is under outright attack right now. It's a common sense policy. We need to be doing it. And there is something you can do. So what we're going to do before we leave is me and Seth are going to pass out a very short description of what is happening, why energy efficiency is good policy, why it needs to remain. And on the reverse side, you'll have a call script and a letter script so that you can send a letter to your legislator, you can send a letter to the governor, you can call the governor's office, you can call the Senate President's office. This is all happening in real time, folks. So if you are interested in doing something on energy efficiency, on natural gas, here's where you can take that first step, and we'll make that easy for you. So I hope that gives you a good feel for what's happening politically in Ohio, and I'm happy to elaborate more when we get to questions. Thanks a lot.
Are there any questions for Nolan quickly right now? You might forget.
Thanks, Cindy. My name is Jordon Suter, and I teach both in the Economics and Environmental Studies departments here at Oberlin. And I'd first start just by thanking the 3 speakers we have coming from outside of Oberlin. I had the easy job of walking down the street from my house and joining you here, but these guys came from all over the country, from New York, and so we appreciate them being part of this conversation, which is a difficult conversation, but an important conversation. And I think the fact that all of you are here tonight, you understand the importance of what's going on. I was asked to speak specifically on the possibility of developing an alternative market, which would be kind of a frack-free market for natural gas, and a market that Oberlin could utilize in that regard. And I think I'll give my kind of Cliff Note answer to that, and I think such a market is feasible, but I don't think it would necessarily have a dramatic impact on the environmental outcomes that we care about. So I think we can all agree that putting in place such a market, if it doesn't have an impact on reducing the environmental impacts of the natural gas that we consume overall, probably isn't worth pursuing, and maybe there are other things that we could pursue that would result in beneficial outcomes. So the idea of a differentiated market, which is what economists refer to this when we kind of break up a particular product that we have in the marketplace and differentiate it by an attribute, has been around for a long time, and we see it in things like organic foods. You can go to the store, you can see two apples that look very similar. One has a label that it's organic, and the other doesn't. And if you're willing to pay more for the organic apple, then that price premium that you're willing to pay then goes on to the producer and ideally alters the production decision that is made so that in the market we see that there's more organic production and less conventional production. It's easier to see with something like an apple where we know the supply chain, we can follow that supply chain, and we know that the production occurred with more environmentally beneficial practices than the practices that went into making the conventional apple. With natural gas, of course, we have a market where the product itself is going to be mixed in some regard. So it's not, we don't have that same clean supply chain where you can say this has definitely been fracked natural gas and this is conventionally drilled natural gas and we can choose which one we want. It would be very difficult to have those kind of supply lines completely differentiated. They're going to mix. But we do see differentiated markets where the supply chain is mixed. So for example, you could purchase wind energy, and the wind energy, those electrons that you actually use to turn on your light bulb, may not come directly from the wind power, but you've purchased the attributes to that wind energy. And as a result, there still is the opportunity for the price premium that you've paid by purchasing that wind energy attribute going to the wind producer, and therefore it alters the economic decision of energy production. There's greater benefits now to producing energy in a green way, in a way that people are willing to pay a premium for, and therefore it may alter the energy mix in the long run. So the idea of a differentiated market for natural gas, if it's going to be effective, it would have to be such that individuals, institutions like Oberlin College would be willing to pay a price premium for gas that's produced conventionally as opposed to fracked, and that then alters the production decision. Because institutions like Oberlin are purchasing frack-free fuel, then there's less fracking that occurs as a result because more producers choose to go the conventional route. So that's at least theoretically how a market like this might work. And there are three reasons why I'm a little bit dubious that this actually would influence production decisions. The first has kind of to do with the nature of the product. And what we actually determine is conventional and what is fracked. So I think what we're most concerned with is the horizontal drilling and the fracking that occurs in these horizontally drilled wells. My estimate is that that's about 40 to 50% of the natural gas supply currently. There's also some supply that may involve fracking, but is a vertical well, and this technology has been around for a fair amount of time, but also involves some amount of fracking. We have offshore sources that are producing natural gas. I don't know if we would consider that to be the frack-free source that we want. And so at the end of the day, we have a lot of different sources. It's hard to decide which is the green one. None of them are green, I would say. Some of them are worse than others in terms of their environmental impact, but it's not as clear a market as obviously the organic apple example, or even the alternative energy example, where we can be pretty clear about what those green attributes are that we're willing to pay for. We need to be clear about what it is that we would be purchasing and what the conventional fuel is that we would be willing to pay that premium for. The second, more fundamental challenge, I think, is the fact that if the supply of the attribute that we want, the conventional supply, is much greater than the demand for that attribute, then the price is essentially going to be zero, right? So if conventional supply is now, say, 20 to 30% of the market, but 20 or 30% of consumers aren't willing to pay a price premium for that attribute, then the price of the attribute is going to be very, very low. And if the price premium on the attribute is very low, then it's not going to impact any production decision that producers are making. And I don't think it's then going to have any environmental impact, any beneficial impact. The final point is that even if there was a price premium, the fact that natural gas is a non-renewable resource means that you're not necessarily choosing which of those two you're getting across a long time horizon. You might get more conventional natural gas and less frac gas in the short term, but at some point that natural gas is still in the ground, and the only way to get at that natural gas that's in the shale formations is through hydraulic fracturing. So my sense is that even if there was a price premium and it impacted production decisions in the short term, it might just be postponing when that natural gas is extracted through hydraulic fracturing. And so in each case, the differentiated market doesn't deliver the environmental outcomes that it does maybe in the case of alternative energy production, where it does provide incentives for more alternative energy generation. And so I guess in trying to be more constructive here, if Oberlin is willing to pay a price premium for an attribute that is greener than the mix of natural gas that's currently in the market, one way to proceed might be to take some of those dollars and rather than trying to pursue a conventional market as opposed to a frac market, using those dollars in a constructive way, either to fund liability concerns that people who have their water impacted in the state of Ohio, there would be a fund available to help alleviate those concerns. The dollars could be spent towards purchasing alternative energy offsets or investing in local energy efficiency, which would then reduce the amount of natural gas that we would consume as a community, even if the college chose to go and utilize natural gas as its primary energy source. At least we would be taking steps to reduce the impact of that decision. So I think that is something that is worthy of a discussion, that we can think about. You know, how can we take some premium and apply that in a way that would result in good or better environmental outcomes. So that's all I have, and I will turn it over next to Adam Peltz.
Hello, I'm Adam Peltz, and I come from the Environmental Defense Fund in New York. I'm an attorney there. I've been there for around a year, newly minted, and this natural gas thing has gotten really big in the last few years. EDF has been around since the 60s and started working on chemicals like DDT. Slowly expanded through the decades and has really taken up the climate change mantle in the last few years. So I'll start with a brief overview of the way that how shale gases have uses grown in the last few years. So as you know, it's an enormous new source of energy in the United States that until a few years ago we couldn't get because we didn't have the technology. But in the early 2000s, engineers figured out how to combine horizontal drilling with hydraulic fracturing. Both of those things have been going on for a long time, but they hadn't been going on together. So now now they can get at all this gas, which is all over the country. It's in 24 states, including Ohio, in the Utica Shale, and so consequentially for Ohio, because of the way that the stuff is disposed in the Marcellus Shale in Pennsylvania, New York. So, so we have all this gas. There's all sorts of environmental issues concerning its extraction. And, I think you're familiar with many of them. I think the biggest deals are groundwater and surface water contamination, air emissions, and then community impacts, especially road traffic, light, and noise. Those are the ways that people interact with shale gas development most. And probably that's what's the most damaging overall. But there's also a potential environmental benefit from shale gas development, and that is that the greenhouse gas footprint of natural gas is around half that of coal. So when you burn coal, it produces twice the amount of greenhouse gases as natural gas does. So so we decided to participate in the whole natural gas discussion, partially because in most states this was already happening. This activity was happening, and we felt that the best way to engage was to look at how to make the rules for the different aspects of shale gas development as good as they could be. And the other reason we decided to participate was this potential huge shift from coal to natural gas use, and with it the potential to significantly reduce the greenhouse gas footprint of electricity production in the United States and potentially beyond. So our advocacy focuses on two main pieces. One is local environmental impacts, so that's air and water, and a few other things that I'll get into. And the other big thing is the climate impact of natural gas versus coal, and how to make sure that climate benefit is actually there. So on the local environmental impacts, what we try to do is get the rules right on 5 different topics. One is chemical disclosure and transparency in general. So that's making the gas companies report exactly what chemicals they're putting into the ground. In case something happens, it's important that we know what those chemicals are. Actually, Ohio's been very progressive on this issue and has expanded the chemical disclosure to include other phases of shale gas development. The hydraulic fracturing is what happens at the end. So you drill down, and then you drill horizontally, and you put down casing, you put down cement, and then you send all this stuff into the ground to open up the fissures. So that happens at the very end. But there's all sorts of stuff that goes on before. When the drilling happens, there's no casing there. So that's really when you have the biggest potential impact for groundwater contamination. And in most states, there's no disclosure of the chemicals used in drilling. So Ohio is actually the first in the country to require that. So that's pretty good. And what's great about this transparency is it forces the companies to say, well, we're putting this toxic thing into the ground. And because they have to say it, they try to find ways to do it less. And in fact, hydraulic fracturing is only one form of completion. There's other ways to open up those fractures. Some of them don't involve water. And because there's so much opposition to using all this water and potentially contaminating water and then having all this wastewater, that the gas companies are coming up with ways to do it without water. And a lot of that is because of these chemical disclosure requirements. The second issue we work on is well integrity, so that's making sure that the wells are constructed properly, because if they're not, they can leak. And if they leak, then it contaminates groundwater, and that's bad. There's different levels of expertise between different operators, and if you have good well integrity rules, then you can sort of level the playing field and make sure that everyone is doing the right thing. We work on water and waste management, so that covers the whole gamut from withdrawals to recycling to storage, transport, store management. There's a lot of ways for water to get dirty from this process. You take too much of it out of trout streams, and then you can't fish. If you recycle it, but you don't have a good place to put the waste stream, then you introduce toxic and radioactive waste all over the place. So all that stuff needs to be locked down by regulations, and it all needs to be tracked. And that takes a lot of work from the state agencies. The fourth thing is about air emissions. There's all sorts of air toxics that come out of this process. Some of it is inherent to the drilling, and some of it is all the equipment that they have on the well pads and running around, the trucks going everywhere. So that stuff needs to be paid attention to and limited. And the fifth thing, which is probably the most important, is community impacts from road traffic, light and noise, any health issues that might arise. Socioeconomic impacts from, suddenly you have a rural farm town that has all of these well pads, and now, all these Texas oil guys are moving in and totally changing the community character. These well pads will come online over the course of years, and it'll be going on for 30 years. So you get one well pad approved, and then the next well pad approved, and then the next well pad approved. But who's paying attention to the fact that you now have 3 well pads running? So that's another issue that we work on. The way we do this advocacy is we partner with state agencies and with the academic community and with other nonprofits and with industry to come up with the best rules and the best practices to do this, and then we try to get it implemented and enforced. So that's one piece, is getting all these rules right. The other piece is about climate. So as I said, natural gas produces half the greenhouse gases as coal when it's burned. That's a big deal because a big chunk of the greenhouse gas footprint in the U.S. comes from electricity generation. So if we switch from coal to gas, which is what is in fact happening, largely because gas is so cheap as a result of this new thing, also because of regulations on coal plants. If you think the climate is important, which I'm sure you all do, there is a potential benefit to this practice, which is important to balance against the local environmental impacts. But the problem with this analysis is that if the methane in natural gas, which is most of the natural gas, leaks at any point during the process, this is from taking it out of the ground to processing it, to transporting it, to distributing it. If it leaks, then you lose your climate benefit, because methane is 25 times more potent a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So this is a really big deal. So no one really knows exactly how much methane is leaking out. There's estimates between 2 and 5%. The EPA has one estimate, industry has another estimate. No one's ever measured it, so no one really knows. So what we've done is to start this very comprehensive methane measurement survey, partnered with 7 major gas companies and 7 major universities, and we're looking at each step along the supply chain and seeing how much leakage is happening. And once we know, then we can start making policies. We already advocate for certain methane leakage reduction technologies in different areas of the drilling process, but we can only be really effective in our regulations if we actually know the leakage rate. And then what we're going to try to do is get states to commit to a low leakage rate. We think 1% is probably the most you can get to still have the climate benefits. So the methane leakage stuff is perhaps as important as everything else. It's hard to balance local environmental concerns on the one hand with climate concerns on the other hand, but there you have it. So I'll just close briefly by talking about shale gas regulations in Ohio. So we have SB 315, and there's going to be a lot of regulations coming out of that. So these are state agencies that are going to take this law and make the regulations that implement the law. There's a public input process when this happens, and it's important that, sometimes an agency will say, here's our rule, everyone comment on it. But no one does, so it just passes. But people who are interested can go to agency hearings and submit comments, and that makes a huge difference. If the comments are, legible to the agency, then they'll policies. And in terms of new legislative things, that would be good. It would be good if the state focused more on the air and methane emissions for the reasons I mentioned. And also, there needs to be an overhaul to the stormwater management and spill control laws. Those are pretty important. Surface spills are one of the biggest causes of surface water contamination from this practice. So a lot of it's technical nitty-gritty stuff, but that's really where you draw the line between shale gas development being polluting and it being fairly low polluting.
Hi everyone, my name is Belcastro and I'm a community organizer with the Community Environmental Defense Fund, Field Defense Fund. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
First of all, I applaud you on your, I can tell, very serious engagement with some pretty difficult moral and ethical dilemmas. These are not new dilemmas that we're faced with as far as the use of fossil fuels or any of these other issues that we face. They're very old. I don't think anybody in the era of colonialism, when the British Empire was expanding itself, I don't think anybody in Europe wanted to think of themselves as the bad guys, as what we all know happened to the people of Africa and the Americas and India and so on. These are all difficult issues, deciding what fossil fuel you're going to use or how you're going to transition and all these things. I'm not going to talk about that stuff so much because it really involves a question of perfecting your roles as consumers. That's a serious question, especially with a large college. But I would ask you maybe to shift your focus over from thinking about your roles as consumers to thinking about your roles as people, sovereign people that actually live in a community that are capable of actually making decisions in that community, especially decisions that have direct, significant impact to your health and your safety and your welfare. Right? So, I want to do something that I've never done before. I feel guilty even doing it. I'm going to quote a bunch of statistics. Dear Lord. Really, I hate doing this stuff. Usually when we hear big numbers, we just go numb. They don't really mean much. But I'm going to try to make a maybe not so obvious point. So, okay, each year in the United States alone, this is just U.S. each year, 570 billion pounds of municipal waste is produced, with 60% of that waste ending up in landfills or incinerators. 4 billion pounds of toxic chemicals, including 72 million pounds of known carcinogens, are released into the atmosphere from 20,000 industrial polluters. And 2 trillion pounds of livestock waste laced with antibiotics, hormones, and chemicals are dumped into waterways and applied to land. 11 million people live within 1 mile of a federal Superfund site. The use of fossil fuels for 85% of our energy use impacts the health of 6 million people in the United States, while warming and polluting the atmosphere. 80,000 industrial chemicals currently are in use in the United States, with more than 700 now found within every human body. 1,800 new chemicals are introduced annually. 40% of our waterways fail to meet even the minimal requirements of federal and state clean water laws. 1/5 of all animals and plant species claim to the edge of extinction, blah, 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 blah. You get the point. Now, this is, again, after about, it was over 40 years ago that we created the EPA and some of the really big national environmental laws that were, viewed as ushering in a new era of environmental protection. Yet by almost all major environmental statistics, things are worse than they've ever been. There's pockets where people are doing a really great job. I live near Pittsburgh. They've certainly cleaned up some things, but overall, things are looking really bad, and so that obviously leads us to start asking the question of what the heck is going on. If the EPA works, if these environmental laws are just so great and they're ushering a new era of protection, why are things getting worse? The one thing I want to not communicate here is that I think it's because of shots we just haven't tried hard enough. That is not what I'm trying to say. We certainly have been trying, I would say very intensely. About the nature of these laws, the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, even one of the labor laws that we deal with. The nature of these laws is just they're actually premised, they're really premised on commerce, they're commercial laws. They're really hooked into the interstate commerce clause of the Constitution at the national level. What that means is that when you want to defend these laws, you have to make arguments that they actually do benefit commerce in a certain way. None of these laws actually recognize any inherent worth or value to nature or to laborers or so on. Again, when laborers, decide to come into their workplace, they leave their rights out in the law laws, right? They're really regulated as items of commerce, not as beings actually of any inherent worth. So, in a way, what we're faced with is laws that are really oddly contorted into the shape of commerce, and those laws have actually produced a culture, after generations of culture of activism, that basically accepts this basic premise as its beginning point, and from there seeks to make whatever arguments it can on behalf of commerce. Our Constitution, technically our second Constitution after the Articles of Confederation, originally didn't even contain really a Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights was placed there because it had no popular support, and that Bill of Rights did not grant anyone rights that did not already have them. It was, again, for white males who had property. It wasn't until enormous amounts of struggle that white people without property could actually participate in government and, again, claim these rights as citizens of the United States of America. And then, black people, Native Americans, and eventually women. Actually, corporations were given personhood rights before even women were. The treatment of people as property, the treatment of nature as property, and there's an enormous amount of legal doctrines that when we choose to, in our own communities, actually create the type of communities that we want, and again, I know there's a lot of talk about sustainability. In a way, I dig sustainability. Really, it's really been our mission to help communities try to achieve that. But in a way, I view sustainability in some ways as almost the lowest possible bar on anything I could possibly really truly consider civilized. I think all of you have it within you, within your hearts, within your souls, within your minds, within your intellect, the ability not just to create sustainable communities, but actually create probably the most mind-boggling, sophisticated, vital, beautiful communities that would just blow people's minds. We can do better. There's something better that we could be doing. The problem is when communities step out to actually say, you know what, I'm going to do this. We're going to actually make this happen. Some of the illusion of the way that they think their legal system works strikes them. Quite often they find that the wills of majorities in communities are overridden, completely subordinated to corporate minorities. Rich white guys quite often, who they don't know, that will probably never meet. And many of the vast decisions, vastly affecting their health and safety and so on, are actually made by people who don't even live in that community. And so, when we choose to actually allow our activism to be steered through certain channels, for instance, just writing letters to, rich big shots and asking them, please, sir, hurt us just a little bit less, please. That when our activism only does those things, only bases on lobbying, at the state level, one of the things we usually see is that we all know what government is supposed to be. It's supposed to be government by the people and government for the people, right? But people don't have the same access to power at the state level that corporate and industry lobbyists do. So it's not surprising to find legislation written on just about every subject you can imagine that was generally at least helped, written by corporate and industry lobbyists or their attorneys and so on. And what we found from people's movements in the United States is that when we had a constitutional structure that was really, in a way, meant, imagine the United States in the beginning, it's this vast open land just full of resources and woods and all these sort of things. There was a certain structure of law that was really intended to accelerate the growth of the United States into a really, into an empire in a way, but into a profound international power. And it worked to do that. It accelerated privilege, it accelerated property and commerce, a full production economy. Again, labor laws, environmental laws are, again, written in such a way to ensure a full production economy. When women were property, which they were, in fact, it was a property fine or something like that, they were viewed as chattel, when black people were viewed as property, or Native Americans, or anybody else who were not viewed as actually citizens in this country actually struggled to change things. They didn't, for instance, the abolitionists didn't create a slave protection agency, right? They didn't try to say, well, you know what we're going to do, the best we can do is just regulate the number of whiplashes slaves receive in a given fiscal quarter, and we say we're going to do a good job and go home. That's not what abolitionists did. They actually strove to take the constitutional structure of law and switch it around to instead a document that actually protected rights, right? So that black people could actually be recognized as human beings with value and actual rights that needed to be protected. Most people's movements usually begin in places where people are actually being harmed by a given activity that's usually a harm that's been legalized. Permits are issued, whatever the case may be. So we usually assume that these things that are occurring, whether it's compressor stations or fracking wells or frack ponds, condensate tanks, compressor stations, the 24/7 diesel traffic, all the stuff that people face when natural gas goes, these things are actually happening somewhere, right? So it's been our strategy to help communities where they actually live achieve the greatest degree of self-determination possible, to instead understand how the legal structure currently actually works, not how they think it works, but how it really works, and then to begin to confront that and actually create and draft, in a way, mini constitutions that actually recognize inherently the rights of nature, the rights of people to govern themselves, people as sovereign, subordinating local municipalities and actually seizing those to actually recognize rights, to actually draft the kind of change that they also want to see at the state level, to see at the national level, and so on. But in a way, it's kind of like a plane taking off. We need the wheels to actually touch ground somewhere in these actually communities where this confrontation actually occurs. If not, we can't get that plane off the ground. We could just go to the state level, but the amount of lobbying and power at that level has generally kept us from actually doing anything. In a way, we have to make the legislature more afraid of us than they are beholden to the industries. So it's an extremely formidable challenge. It's a generations-long one. This is not a quick fix for anyone. We've worked with a lot of communities on the fracking issue. I believe it's now been 13 communities in Pennsylvania, in New York, in Maryland, and New Mexico, and now in Ohio just recently over the last few months, to draft laws that actually, instead of saying, well, we're going to admit right off the bat that we don't have any rights whatsoever to say what the hell happens in our own community, and all that we can do is maybe zone it, just say where in our community we're going to surrender. And instead of just surrendering, we're actually just going to assert, you know what, actually not here, not now. We're going to decide the fate of our community, plain and simple. And you can sue us if you want. That's real cute. And you can come to court and argue that you have rights and we have none, and that's fine. And it's a very difficult position to be put in where communities are. It's very difficult. But even if we get our ass kicked, at least we're on the battlefield. At least these communities are on the battlefield. They are not at the table negotiating away the rights of future generations and themselves. They are not saying, you know what, sure, we admit it, you can do whatever you want, and we'll just try to minimize the harm. The problem with regulations, though we would, especially if we deem a certain activity to not be inherently violating of rights, we would hope for strong regulation. And when something does happen, because you can't stop it, you would certainly be thankful for people who work at the state level to actually, hopefully, draft some sort of stronger regulation. But in a way, we feel that people deserve a little better than just surrendering. Just surrendering. Just saying, all right, you know what, do what you want. So it's a very, like I said, it's a very formidable and difficult challenge. So just to summarize, first, we actually want people to understand how the legal structure works, right? That's a complex one all of in itself. It's not a simple one. Second, we actually want these communities to actually put forward challenges and actually assert and vindicate rights at the local level. And we want to thread those communities together who have actually drafted laws showing what constitutional change might look at the state and national level, and thread those communities together. We're a lot further ahead in Pennsylvania than we are in Ohio, but at least things are moving. If you have any questions, I'm here. We'll be going to breakout sessions immediately after this. So.
So that was really awesome, and I want to compliment the four speakers because you actually stayed within your time limits remarkably well. That takes incredible self-discipline. And the reason that's important is because it leaves us more time to have a conversation and to ask questions. Before we head off in different directions, are there questions people would like to ask with the four speakers in the room? For example, what does Nolan think about something that Adam said, or are there questions like that would be really interesting to hear them talk to each other? Yeah.
I think it was Adam who talked about the climate impacts of fracking and natural gas exploitation. And one of the things you were kind of saying was like, if assuming we have a low leakage rate, we have half the greenhouse gas emissions from coal. This is great. But what about the technological lock-in that's inherent in any natural gas investiture, and doesn't that technological lock-in prevent us from making the step we need to make in 5 years?
Well, I think that's could I say that?
Yeah.
Okay. I think that's a totally fair question. People talk about natural gas as a bridge to a clean energy future, but it's not a clean energy future itself. So, the way to make sure that you prevent lock-in with natural gas is ultimately to put a price on carbon. So this way, eventually, natural gas becomes non-competitive with renewables also. 5 years is tough. I'll admit that. You can pursue offsetting, but the lifetime of something new will be a little bit more than that. Still better than coal, and the cost of switching from coal straight to renewables on a global scale is astronomical. If we could figure out a way to afford it, that would be great. But probably the way that it will work in practice is a little slower than that. And in that case, natural gas is so much less worse than coal that I think that it's worthwhile to make that shift. But then you have to keep fighting to make sure that the switch to renewables happens, either through a renewable energy standard or a price on carbon. So that's really what to fight for. And then if you have a price on carbon, or if you have a cap, and the cap keeps lowering, which is something that can be done on the state level. Even if Congress can't do it, it can be done on a state level. California's doing it right now, and cap and trades are happening all over the world. So that's the sort of thing that will need to come in order to get rid of natural gas once its life cycle is over, which, hopefully will be sooner than later.
I have a follow-up, maybe Professor Suter can answer, but we know on the market level that when the natural gas prices are going to continue to fall as we expand hydrohydraulic fracturing and gas prices, and that's going to give an incentive for consumers to buy more gas, to increase their inputs, to increase the amount of energy that they're using. And also on the local level with Oberlin, that this is a pretty, to my understanding, capital intensive decision of where we're going to get our heating from. And if we put all this capital and all this money towards acquiring natural gas, wouldn't that just give an incentive not to switch off in 5 years? And especially with gas prices falling. So how do we not get ourselves locked in with the way, economically speaking?
Go ahead, Jordon, solve that one.
No, I mean, it's a challenging question. There's no doubt that the greater the supply of natural gas that's being exploited, the lower the price is going to be. And we're seeing not just power plants switching over to natural gas, but also transportation systems and so forth. And there is going to be a degree of lock-in. I mean, the lower price of natural gas means, not only less incentive for coal, but less incentive for other alternatives. And that's the reality of it. And I think that, as Adam was saying, pushing for carbon policy, whether it's a regulatory policy or a tax or cap and trade system, is essential moving forward to provide better incentives for developing alternatives. But some of the shift towards natural gas is inevitable as the price continues to drop. I mean, as these transitions occur, as transportation systems move to natural gas, you do get this natural kind of halt to the price, because more people are going to be, the quantity demanded is going to continue to rise as the price goes down. So that will eventually stop the price from falling. And I think if you look at the long-term predictions of natural gas prices, they're not predicted to go much lower than they are right now. But I am not going to be in the business of predicting the natural gas price even in the next few years. So.
If you could, you'd be a billionaire.
Yeah, if I could. I will dabble into that.
I want to be mindful of the time. I see 3 questions, and I want to take those, and then I want to make sure that we have time for the smaller conversations. We'll start with you. Question?
Yeah. This is for Adam. You mentioned trying to do work to reduce the amount of leakages and casing integrity and stuff like that. And I was wondering what you thought about the concept that all wells leak over time, and so how would you deal about looking on a longer time horizon? There are predictions that in 15 years, 50% of all well casings in offshore drilling are leaking. So what happens what about a longer time horizon? Yes. Especially with abandoned wells.
Right. I mean, there's ways to plug abandoned wells that are industry standard. The problem is that not every operator does it the right way. So a lot of this stuff is you can have all the regulations in the world. If you don't actually enforce them, then you're not gonna get the benefit from the better regulations. Wells can be constructed so that they don't leak. But they're not being constructed that way because the regulations aren't there and the enforcement isn't there. So I agree with you that the precautionary principle is really strong. I certainly understand the value of it. One problem is that, I'll rephrase. And I can see where there's disagreement with this, but this practice is happening. So these wells are being drilled. And, you know, the environmental community could band together and say there's no way this could ever be safe. We don't think that that would work. You know, and I certainly understand why that sounds a little sad. But, you know, there's hundreds of thousands of wells already, and more are being drilled all the time. So, you know, what we can do, what we feel, what we get the biggest bang for the buck is to go to these state agencies and say, no, you have to make them do it this way, and you have to check on them a lot. And that's what we think is going to decrease damage to those.
Sharon, you had a question?
Yeah, Nolan didn't present a very positive legislative picture, but one of the ways that our city, the city of Oberlin, is looking at this is the possibility of passing legislation reaffirming our right to local rule. And that would theoretically give us control over what happens, at least here in Oberlin. Is that a movement that is growing at all in the state, and does it have any true legislative significance?
Yes, it does. So the home rule is a very sensitive subject in Ohio, and the natural gas and other extractive industries worked successfully to take a lot of local powers away from local governments. Did that over a period of years. It goes back about 20 years. However, legislators are sensitive to their smaller communities in their districts, and when several of them are taking action on this issue, this is something that can get their attention and can start some traction down at the State House. Specifically, at the end of the day, legislators are accountable to you as voters, and that's a fundamental tenet of our democracy. So the idea that you lack power and you lack the ability to change them is fundamentally wrong. You do. They pay attention to you. We're their constituents. And when you're angry about something, when something's important to you, they pay attention. Money, power, corporate interests, they all have a tremendous ability to warp our system. But at the end of the day, it's the ability of people like yourself to show up, to take a stand, to say something that moves the needle. You know, all the great achievements we've had in this country have been because people have said enough. People have said, I want it, and this is why we need it. So I'm going to ask you one more time to do that today. We have an energy efficiency law. It's under threat.
That's not why we're here.
I understand. I understand. But this is important. This is important. If you want to reduce the amount of natural gas we're using in this state and in this country, we need to embrace energy efficiency. And it has a huge impact. I'll give you an example. In just 2 years, okay, first 2 years of our standard, we've taken the equivalent of 3,000 megawatt coal plants offline permanently from this law. That's how much energy we're saving. We've saved customers over $1 billion. That's one utility has done that. This is hundreds of thousands of megawatt hours that we're saving. Huge carbon impact, huge climate impact, and it only grows, but it's under threat because of big utilities. So I'm going to ask you one more time. That's it, so thank you.
Last question, David.
One way to affect the price of natural gas, and one way to affect, a very important way to affect the environmental outcome is, as we've heard, everybody's spoken directly to this, is through legislation and regulation. I'd like to ask Nolan Moser what we can expect. He's often invited us to be active, assertive citizens. What can we expect from the regulatory climate in Ohio? Are the legislators, are the regulators willing and capable, even on the restricted staffs, restricted budgets, and apprehension about being seen as facilitators of corporate power, all that. Tell us what we can expect. Is Ohio going to be fully deserving of its the governor's pronouncement that, boy, we are really doing a great job regulating this industry? Or are we being flummoxed?
Yeah, it depends. People have to be mad. They have to get involved. There's a series of regulations that will come through the Ohio Department of Natural Resources. So what you want to do, the Ohio Department of Natural Resources has a whole section of their website devoted to these new rules. That's where you want to look. Those need to be focused on model rules. Adam has lots of information about the rule process and how you can get involved. But people need to, the regulators need to hear from people. People need to be upset about what's happening in terms of their water and their land and their local communities. And if people show that they're upset and they show what they want in terms of a stronger regulatory structure, it goes a long way.
Okay. Oh, Lisa, I can tell you really need to say something.
Question for Eric Belcastro. Would you say that the idea of transition of gas as a transition from coal to renewables or something not harmful is a myth? And if so, would you say it's a myth being put out by the industry that you talked about, the large-scale commercial industry? And if so, what do you think a good transition would be instead of?
I can't, first of all, I would say, to give an example, they used to dump sludge off the ocean, municipal waste, industrial waste and stuff, dump it off the ocean in New Jersey, right? And so they needed to find some sort of use for the stuff, some sort of at least seemingly positive use so that they might even be able to make a buck off of it, right? So they started calling it biosolids. You call it biosolids and your mind just draws a blank. PR firms were given money to come up with this stuff. The use as a transition fuel, I would say the term is probably thought up by PR firms. And by using it, you're just advertising for them for free. It is legitimately a transition fuel if Oberlin is intelligent and careful about what they do and how they choose. I'm not here to tell people about what choices they should, do or which they should buy or not buy or so on. But I would say it sure strikes me as a PR gimmick more than a real fundamental reality. I look at some of the science and I would say it's ambiguous, but not really promising in terms of its environmental impacts, on the long haul. In fact, I would say it's absolutely dreadful what's occurring, and it's not really truly, inherently better in many ways. But I can't pretend like I'm impersonal about this stuff. I live around it, and I know a lot of people have been affected by it. So, I can't give the most impersonal advice on that.
Okay, so we have four really articulate speakers that have represented four different approaches, in some ways compatible and in some ways very different. We want now to facilitate as much conversation and interaction as possible between you all in the audience and these four people. So what we will do is have Nolan and Jordon head upstairs to the rooms that are up there, and people that would like to talk with them can join them there. We will have Adam be in the classroom that is down the hall, and people who want to talk more with Eric can be out in the lobby area. Okay, and so there will be a There will be. Okay, so there'll be two OCDC facilitators there to make sure the conversation is as productive as possible, and there will also be members of us who've been helping to organize these events be present as well, so that we can hear the conversations that you all are having. Okay, as a request came from earlier, we will convene back here. Those who are interested can convene back here. Why don't we say 9:20, because that gives us half an hour, and we can do any other sharing that we want to do at that point. Thank you all for coming and for asking such great questions. So I was taking notes on the group that was meeting with Eric, and that group explored a lot more deeply the concept of giving rights to the natural world and to ecosystems, and the importance of having people feel connected back to those ecosystems. And I just have to say that that's what I do research on, so that was really cool to hear your group talk about that. And there was interest in thinking about how the community of Oberlin could take advantage of this rights-based approach. And Eric clarified a little bit about how the city of Oberlin could amend its charter, and that had more weight and legal standing than simply passing an ordinance by city council. So those were kind of the highlights.
And then I was in Nolan's group, and we talked about the energy efficiency laws, and if anyone's interested, take one of these papers from them, they're right over here. And then we also talked about how activists should really work on getting people to meetings. And then we talked about, and like that will make more changes. And then we talked about needing in these buildings to get heating in each individual room so that people are able to monitor each room.
Could you elaborate on the meetings thing?
Well, heating or meetings?
Meetings. Oh,
meetings? We were just saying that to make changes, if more people are at each meeting, then it will make people like the governor and people in power feel like there's more need to change.
I'm going to really quickly summarize what within Jordon's group we talked about. So we talked about how we're going to spend the money that people are willing to pay. We talked about that natural gas was the cheapest option, and that's why we're taking off coal factories. And legislation is possible, and students can make a difference and make sure that colleges stays with their promises and decisions that they make. And so one of the students raised the question of how that we want to upgrade the heating system in our college, because she's concerned with students who have to open their windows to let the heat out when the rooms are overheated. But another person also raised the problem of a possible solution of trying to educate people of how to better use the heating systems that we already have, other than try to do more work in upgrading the system that we already have. And the other notes that we have here, I'm also going to send it to the group, and we're going to share with the other notes that I haven't over.
Is there representative for?
I honestly have no idea what our group talked about. I was even in the room. We talked sort of about increasing transparency and the way that we can hold companies accountable, and then they are also less likely to do things like dump diesel down wells, and how the ODNR is A, understaffed, and B, sort of corrupt. Talked about the importance of both of activists demanding saying this isn't safe for me to stop now, and also people who are willing to talk about regulation and getting a seat at the table, and sort of different ways of negotiating for regulations and requiring air and water testing. Things I forgot.
That's pretty good.
Cool. Yeah. There will be notes. Yeah, you should.
Just to reiterate, lots of really good ideas that I just heard and they flew past, and I hope that they're written down and those notes will go out to people. But as soon as Rob and Jane and I can figure out our schedules, we will post. Basically, we're referring to them sort of as open office hours, where we will be as a rise or something, and we will send an email out to everybody that was here, so that if things come up in your head later, or there was something that came up in the small group that you really think needs to be said again to the three of us, we will be making ourselves available for you to come have those conversations. So it doesn't stop right now. These notes will be read and reviewed, and then you can also continue that conversation. It'll be sometime in the evening, either this week or next week, but we're just having a hard time working out our schedule. So we'll get that information to you as soon as we have that nailed down.
The minutes will be sent tomorrow, so you all will have the minutes.
I want to thank fabulous community members and Oberlin students who showed up and who have stayed for so long and who are so thoughtful and constructive and critical in all the best ways. Thank you very, very much. And again, we will have more events like this coming up in the spring, and you'll be hearing about those as well.
Thank you, Cindy.
Yep.